Hello, and welcome to today's webcast, Global Digital Identity Assurance, the Key to Secure Remote Work. I'm Terry Takai, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Digital Government, and I'm excited to serve as the host for today's webcast. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have a great session over the next 30 minutes. But before we begin, we have a few housekeeping notes for you all to take a look at. And during today's webcast, you'll be able to connect with your peers via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. For those of you on Twitter, please use hashtag GovTechLive to share key takeaways, quotes, and learnings from today's webcast. To ensure business continuity and safety during the global pandemic, state and local government CIOs did what had to be done. They swiftly moved tens of thousands of employees to remote work. But while these actions have allowed government to continue the critical work of serving citizens, it also may have them relying on personal devices and unsecured networks. And that's broadened the attack surface for cybercriminals and made it easier to succeed with phishing scams and malware. According to recent research from Barracuda Networks, coronavirus-related spear phishing attacks increased by 667% in March 2020. And all of those are of great concern to CIOs, as they're really seeing that remote work will be continuing, and how can they make sure that their employees and that their critical networks and services are protected. Joining me today to discuss this topic is Dr. Stephen Topless, who's the Vice President Product Strategy with LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Dr. Topless is a thought leader in fraud and identity and digital identity. As Vice President, Global Market Planning at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, Dr. Topless is responsible for providing the strategic and tactical direction for fraud and identity for the international markets. Dr. Topless previously opened the Threat Metrics European office in 2010 and spent time as head of global consulting services and head of product strategy before Threat Metrics was acquired by LexisNexis Risk Solutions in early 2018. So we're very enthused to have Dr. Topless with us today and to provide us with some really key insights on how digital identity is really a huge part of cybersecurity assurance, and what are the steps and tips that he would give to all of us in terms of moving forward with remote work, but moving forward in a really secure way. So, Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Terry. Yeah, we're going to spend some time talking about the concept of global digital identity assurance. And this is really relevant right now as we're protecting against cyber threats in this new era of working from home. So what is digital identity assurance? Well, it's basically a way of verifying that a person's claimed identity online really matches their digital identity, their digital footprint as they interact online, their behavior and their activity. And LexisNexis Risk Solutions offers a digital identity assurance through its Threat Metrics for Government product. And what this product is basically doing is it's providing this form of identity verification by matching the digital signatures at the moment that someone is logging in online with the historical representation of their digital identity, which is continuously being dynamically updated in a global tokenized digital identity network. And this digital identity network is being fed by 150 million events every day as people go about logging in to tier 1 banks, e-commerce sites, public-facing corporate portals. And so this digital identity is constantly evolving. And at the moment that you log in anywhere in the world and you're connected to this digital identity assurance system, we can basically look through a set of rules to look for a match or not with that digital identity. And just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what kind of matching we're talking about here, you could imagine things like, at the moment that you're logging on, is this user using the same device that they normally use? Are they logging on from the same types of locations where they've historically logged in from? How do they connect? Are they connecting directly, or are they actually going through a proxy server or a VPN? Is there anything malicious on the device that could potentially suggest there's a threat or a compromise there? So by having a model in place which can be tuned to each of our clients differently based on exactly what the application is, we can provide this digital identity assurance as part of a login process. I'm sorry, Terry, I think you're on mute.
There you go. You're right. Thanks, Stephen. Thank you for that update. And, I really am intrigued because this is such a great place for LexisNexis to come together with ThreatMetrix to really bring together that network, if you will, as you said, of identities with actually then being able to validate who you are. I mean, I think that, one of the things that our audience is going to be really interested in, though, is what do you see as the most common work from home cyber threat? What are the things that move to remote work, and how has that actually increased the cyber threat for those employees?
So as soon as we move to this work from home environment, the one critical difference is that we're taking our devices outside of that secure office environment. We're suddenly exposing them to unmanaged networks. Maybe they are managed more or less. It depends, how sophisticated we are with our networks, but it's not the same as a corporate or government network environment, which is obviously, locked down and secure. This is really your biggest immediate risk, and it opens the door to malicious attacks. Ultimately, the threats haven't changed. The threats are still the same, whether it's a phishing attack or other means of trying to get your credentials, or attacks directly onto the device itself through malware, for example. The attacks are still the same, but it's more difficult to identify them and potentially stop them. And there are actually other concerns once you're working from home, in that there may be IT procedures that get delayed. So, for example, you can think of the patches and updates that are regularly done to Office devices. It may be that those patches and updates are delayed, or the rollout of them is done much more carefully to avoid disruption of you when you're working from home. I had an experience last week that through an upgrade, my device actually was out of action for an hour or two, and I had to work through that with the help desk. So those kind of impacts can be greater when you're working from home. So there may be a decision to delay some of those patches, which potentially puts you, more at risk than you normally would be. And if you actually go a step further than that, if your in-house security staff are also being forced to work from home, then you've potentially got opportunities for compromise through communication with them, through sharing of information, again, because things are starting to go less through those secured networks that you have in the office. If your device is at home, it could be compromised, and actually it could also much more easily potentially be stolen.
Well, you gave us a great backdrop for individuals who actually have a laptop, or in some cases we know that there were government folks that went into the office, picked up their desktop units and actually brought them home so that they had and were able to access. But I think there's also a number of employees that are using their own home devices and not necessarily devices that were supplied by their either state or local government. So is the threat greater on those devices? And, where does the threat come from? And, how does the threat increase if you're using your own personal device?
Yeah, and it's a good point. Some of us are very used to having our laptops with us and traveling everywhere, but those desktop devices, many people don't have the ability to take a laptop home. And from the government's point of view, you're not in a position from a cost point of view, but also just from being able to acquire enough laptops to provide your employees to take these things home. So inevitably, you're going to be looking at employee devices, and that introduces a whole load of interesting things to weigh up and balance, because you can reduce costs by relying on employee devices, but what are you going to do with that employee device to make sure it's secure? So to your point, is it as secure as a government supplied device? No, it's not going to have some of those standard build features on there around anti-malware and potentially other security features. You could insist that all employee devices have some kind of unified endpoint protection software installed on them. There's a cost associated with that again, and you'll probably find that some of your employees are actually not really very happy with that. It starts introducing certain privacy aspects. How much of your employee device is really going to be controlled now, not by themselves? So do they want their personal devices to have something installed on there? So it is a balancing act. There isn't really an ideal solution there, to be perfectly honest. And this is where digital identity assurance can potentially add a layer of protection that kind of, if you're choosing a middle ground here between allowing access to certain parts of your infrastructure, balanced with some levels of security, digital identity assurance may bridge the gap there. But it's an interesting conundrum to face.
That's great. We just, and by the way, I just want to remind the audience that we will be taking some questions at the end. So if you have questions, please feel free to submit them during the session, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. In the beginning, Stephen, we talked about the increase that was cited in that Barracuda Networks article of cyber attacks. And one of the things that I find really challenging is that these are, in many cases, social engineering attempts that go with phishing attempts. So it's really unfortunately taking advantage of the current situation. And so where do you see these attacks growing? Where do you see them coming from? And, how do you advise individuals where, they want to be able to do things to help, but at the same token, they have to be so careful when something comes across the network that they're sure they're not introducing additional vulnerabilities?
Yeah, you're right. We're seeing countless reports now from a variety of sources of that increased threat that is occurring. It doesn't really come as a surprise to us, just based on what we've seen in our own network over the last 10 years as we've built up that digital identity network. If we look a little bit back into the past, we see every holiday season, as everyone goes online to buy goods, we see those increased threats. When there are major sporting events, the Olympics, the Super Bowl, we see peaks in attacks then. And basically, the cybercriminals have learned that when there's a rise in activity online, it's the perfect place to be hiding amongst that activity. Or if there are issues in the news or concerns, you can ride the emotion of us humans, unfortunately, to take advantage of us. So there's no doubt that phishing in particular is on the rise, and quite targeted attacks as well. The concern, of course, then is that if you're working from a home in these home networks, everything we just talked about means that even if there wasn't an increase, you're more at risk, just generally because of that less than ideal situation. And so now as these attacks grow, they're combining together. And I think where I have the concern is that those attacks are going to start getting more and more targeted. Organizations are going to be targeted people are going to be identified to target specifically, and then to your point, social engineering becomes a big problem. Again, talking from experience in other areas, I've seen heads of fraud at banks who have been specifically targeted, and sometimes, really have been caught out victim of these kind of attacks, because it doesn't matter how savvy you think you are, you can't rely on yourself to prevent this. So you need to have the right layers of security in place.
Stephen, I know many on the line and many in our audience, are part of the community that really has put in technical solutions, to address really the cyber problem. And, in many cases, all of state and local government has really relied on both VPN and, in many cases, a big push to identity management and single sign-on in combination with VPN. But given what we're seeing today and given the remote situation, is that enough security?
So let's touch on both of those in turn. So VPN's really there to enable that secure connectivity between a device and the resources in the office. And it's very good at what it does. The issue is if that remote device is compromised and potentially the credentials are stolen. If I have control of your device and I can get through your authentication process, activate the VPN, then I have access to your systems through a very secure connection, because that's what VPN's good at. The single sign-on, the idea behind single sign-on is also twofold. It's improving the user experience, that you don't have to log in multiple times to different applications, and also that brings security because you don't have to enter your login details frequently. So the risk there is, again, if your credentials have been compromised, that then opens the door to lots of applications. So both of these technologies are very good at what they do and absolutely should be in place. But what I would argue is that you need to look beyond those two to have a real layered approach to providing a more secure environment for people at home to actually be able to work remotely.
Stephen, could you expand on that concept of layered approach? Because I think in many cases we think of VPN and single sign-on as being a layered approach. And so what else do we need to be thinking about in addition to those two components to have a really truly secure layered approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the concept that really, the fundamental concept to introduce and talk about here is a risk-based approach, which typically these two solutions don't have. So I'll do it in two steps, actually. First of all, we're talking about this concept of a digital identity assessment. Imagine that was at the very front door. So before you go through authenticating yourself to use VPN or single sign-on, imagine there was this kind of security checkpoint, just as you're going through a checkpoint at the airport. And the first thing it's doing is it's just validating, am I really who I say I am on the internet? And if you start from that concept, we can actually draw out a kind of a layered approach diagram here. So this, if you like, is an ideal scenario. So starting on the far left-hand side, you've got your devices, whether they're work-supplied devices, government-supplied devices, or whether they're personal devices. In an ideal world, you'd have this unified endpoint management software installed on those devices, keeping them 100% safe, or as safe as they can be. Then as you're going through that connection process, the first thing you do is you have a digital identity assessment process. So we can talk a bit more about that in a minute, but again, that concept of validating that it's really your digital identity that is beginning an authentication process. Then the authentication process begins, username and password. Ideally there is a second factor challenge in play, and then you get to the VPN and the single sign-on. Now, that's an ideal scenario, but if you look at it in practice, if we take, we've talked already about the unified endpoint management. It's not cheap. It has questions around, can you really enforce your staff to install it on your personal devices, on their personal devices? So the chances are that your devices are going to have a range of software and security on the devices themselves. For me, having the digital identity assessment layer gives you a risk-based approach immediately to highlight, are there any risks? As you then go through the authentication approach, that second factor challenge, Gartner has reported with identity access management deployments, less than 10% of those deployments today have the ability to actually introduce a second factor. So while it can be very secure, it's actually not being used very often. And when it is being used, it's often being used as a really hard, 100% of the time, user-unfriendly approach to accessing and logging into the system. So in an ideal world, you'll use your digital identity assessment to assess the risk ahead of authentication. And if there is an elevated risk, you can either force that second factor challenge, or you can generate alerts to the security team or the SOC so that they can also monitor that login process. So that's kind of how I see a layered approach working.
That's great. Thank you. Can you just talk a little bit more about, in that layered approach, for the digital identity assessment, what are really the components of that, sort of that next step down, if you will, and how does that actually work with the rest of the layered approach?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I kind of briefly touched on at the beginning, the digital identity assessment is basically an assessment that's made at the start of that authentication process to look at all of the digital intelligence gathered from the device at that moment of logging in to validate if it matches with the digital identity that it is associated with you. So again, device location, but drilling down even into, how do I enter my password with my keyboards, the interactions, it's really your behavior itself. And that assessment is carried out by a policy of rules, a set of rules that are matching and looking on those things. And those rules are normally dynamic in capability. They're learning the behavior over time and looking for anomalies. The way the software works is it's a software as a service. So that means there's no appliance to install, there's no software or server to install, there's no endpoint agent that has to be installed on the customer's device. So it's actually a very light touch layer from an implementation point of view. And because of that approach, it's also, to a certain extent, future-proof for identity threats. The intelligence that you analyze, the digital intelligence that's analyzed, is continually being updated based on the threats that are seen elsewhere, based on new capabilities that emerge as devices become more sophisticated, more intelligence can be gathered. And it's already being used around the world by tier one banks to protect their access to end customer accounts. So you've kind of got in different industries, this technology is continually being pushed to its limits. And that really then provides you with this identity assurance that can be used in government as well.
Mm-hmm. What are some additional benefits from the digital identity intelligence that you get by doing the assessment? So
I guess in a nutshell, we talked a little bit kind of how it works, it's that risk assessment before authentication. What the benefits it brings is that you can actually continue to leverage your existing access management tools. So what you have in place today doesn't need to be thrown out. It's an extra layer that can be slotted in there that takes typically a fairly yes, no, or black and white approach to authentication. It introduced that risk-based approach. And you're able then to tune those thresholds accordingly. What it also can potentially introduce for you is a single view across both the employer and employee devices. So again, as you look at introducing access for employees from their own personal devices, you may have very limited information about those devices if you're not installing endpoint software on them. This will at least give you a layer of digital intelligence so that you can be assured that it's the same personal devices being used every time in the same type of access. So you can actually build a level of assurance with those devices, even though they're personal devices. And so through all that, you're really being able to prevent some of these external threats from taking over devices or stealing compromised credentials and accessing cyber criminals trying to access your network from elsewhere using those compromised credentials and therefore safeguard your protected assets. The other thing to bear in mind is it's not really introducing any friction here. In fact, it can be working the other way. If you are using a two-factor authentication approach, you can actually use it to reduce employee friction by only choosing to use that second factor when there is a clear risk involved. So it gives you the flexibility, really, to align with your existing and future security plans.
Well, I think the value that that I really think is huge for government is really the point you make around you don't have to treat who has their own devices versus who's working with a government device. And it's almost unique device by device that you can actually see what the potential threats are and actually understand how you may need to mitigate those. So, a lot of great benefits to really thinking, forward about that approach. Well, Stephen, we have time for a couple of questions, and we got some great questions here. So I want to, go to these questions. This is a great one, and there's one of the individuals in the audience is saying that, of course, state government is now looking at allowing IT staffs to continue to work from home. I mean, some are actually saying it's going to be through the end of the year. So what would your advice be in terms of what you think the security office and the security staff should be thinking about? And let's just say, if in fact this continues at least till the end of the year and even beyond.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, I think it's going to open the door more and more to cyber criminals really having a good, hard think about how to take advantage of the situation if they're not already doing that enough today. And I think you'll see more targeted attacks there. So this is certainly where we see in other sectors when these new threats and these new attacks really hit an organization, they're looking to put something in that immediately gives them an extra level, an extra layer of intelligence that they can rapidly act on. And so that's really where that digital identity assurance, because it's such a lightweight touch, it can be put in place very quickly, and it's flexible enough to help you identify where those risks are. But at the same time, for those employees that are spending longer periods of time at home, it can very rapidly build up that profile of their digital identities so that you know when you can really trust those interactions. And what's interesting is it's a global tokenized digital identity. So your employees already have these digital identities. They're just being built up from logins that they're carrying out elsewhere. So that level of trust can actually be built up very, very quickly by taking advantage of the global network, which is used both from a trust point of view, but also from identifying known global threats.
Thank you. Well, Stephen, I think this has been just a fascinating 30 minutes, and I know it's just gone so quickly. But I want to be respectful of our time commitment, so we'll have to wrap it up here. In closing, I'd really like to thank you for sharing your insights on today's webcast. I'd also like to thank our partners at LexisNexis Risk Solutions for making it possible to have this important webcast today. Please also be sure to view the resources widget at the bottom of your screen for additional resources on today's topic. And thank you to our audience for spending time with us. We look forward to seeing you again soon at another government technology event. Have a great rest of your day.